Hi folks, it is Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video, and for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. Today, I'm very excited to be continuing my series about practical guitar and music theory. Specifically, we're going to be learning how to play a G major chord. G major is one of the chords in the framework known as the Cage system. This is just one of the most kind of inspired sort of frameworks and methods to learning how to play practical guitar, and this isn't the first video in the series, so I've also done C and A major and also minor, A major and A minor, and I've done a series of other videos, for instance, about bar chords or the finger fretting system, things like that to consider. So if you haven't seen these other videos, I recommend checking them out. And the G major chord is a versatile chord. It is perhaps more limited than A major or the A minor shapes, but it's still handy to know, especially because so many songs actually use this chord shape. And also, I think what's nice about the G major chord in particular is it sets us up in principle to get more familiar with the major-minor variation, which I consider to be the C shape or G shape, and that's kind of unique. So if this sounds interesting to you, please definitely consider staying tuned. Please consider liking the video and, of course, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. I know I have over 200 subscribers, and that's just so wonderful. Thank you, really, it means a lot. So I have an archetype, a whole system through which to get through these kind of videos. The first thing I'll be talking about, this is kind of our overview, I'll be talking about finger placement. So there will be at least 2 variations of every chord in the Cage system. That's because we'll need to presumably want to bar any one of these chords, and therefore, whereas we would typically use our index finger or finger 1 in the original or primary fretting position, we'll need to free it up so that we can bar that chord shape and move it around. Then I want to talk about the relative intervals within the open chord shape. And through that, I hope to demonstrate even more that kind of Cage system, our ability to move things proportionately. And I think that's helpful to consider as well. I want to talk briefly about the advantages to this specific chord shape. And then finally, I'll talk about troubleshooting that's also unique to this chord shape. Issues you might run into, ways to make it a bit easier. I have to say G major is one of the chords in the Cage system that is quite spaced out. So even if you only get the first part of it done, you know, actually that's pretty effective. But if you want to play the full open major chord, you might run into a few problems, but it's a forgiving chord, which is nice. So hopefully today's video is a breeze, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So finger placement, the primary finger placement, if I asked any guitarist or beginner guitarist or one of my students, play a G major chord, they would go for this shape here. That is a G major. And what they're doing is they're using the following fingers. So we start with our middle finger, or finger 2, and finger 2 is going to be on the 3rd fret of the E string. And that's because when we count up from E, we have E, F, F sharp, G. And of course, when it comes to triads, we always want to keep in mind the root. So when we look at the chord G major, G is our root. So we start from here, and every subsequent interval that we'll talk about later is relative to that root right there. Then the next finger we'll be using is finger 1, or our index finger. That will be placed on the 2nd fret of the A string. That's the string just below E. So we have E and A, or Eddie 8, right? So we're going to place our index finger, finger 1, on the 2nd fret of the A string. Then we're just going to leave all the other strings open until we get to the top E string. That string right there. And we are going to hold down that 3rd fret on the high E string to produce yet another G. And this is sort of already a beginning of a practical string roll I like to think about, which is basically kind of a reciprocal practical string roll, sorry about that, a reciprocal practical string roll, which is basically whatever you do to the low string, if you mirror it on the high string, well, the intervals are equal because the low string is E, but so is the high string. They're both E. So whatever, if you hold down the 1st fret on the low E, it's the same note as the 1st fret on the high E, right? Because they're both F. They're both F sharp, they're both G. So at this point, it's worth just saying, not getting into the interval stuff yet, but it's worth pointing out we are playing the same note on the bottom as we are on the top. And so when I was saying that this is a forgiving chord, it's because if you happen to not play the high string, the high E, if you're not playing that note, that's also a G. And this would be an acceptable way to play G, omitting the top 3rd fret on the E string. So it's worth just considering that. That's chord variation 1, fretting variation 1 rather. Now, you might have noticed we used our index finger, finger 1, and anytime we need to construct a bar, we need to free our index finger up so that way we can produce the bar. Now, I will say in the cage system, it is pretty tricky to play a bar chord version of the G shape. That's because we are 3 frets away from the nut. So look at that. So remember when I was talking about bar chords, the purpose of a bar chord is actually to emulate the distance and shaping of the nut. So actually, if the root needs to be 3 frets away from the nut, then that means wherever we put our bar, our index finger, or I mean our ring finger that's holding down that 3rd fret, also needs to be 3 frets away. So if you hold down your bar chord on 3, you actually need to place the root on 6. And then you would need to play that high mirrored sort of note. There you go. That is a that is a barred G shape. It's not especially convenient, and I have to say right now, as an experienced player, I don't really resort to that shape, but it is still helpful to know about. So in order to do that, you might have noticed I freed up the index finger, so I had to refret some things, sort of move some fingers around. So this is chord fretting variation number 2. Instead of using our middle finger, or finger 2, on the root, we're now going to use our ring finger, finger 3. That's going to play the low 3rd fret on the E string. Then we're going to take our middle finger, or finger 2, yeah, and hold down the 2nd fret of the A string. Then we're going to take our pinky and we're going to hold down that 3rd fret on the high E string, like that. That is the other way we can play the G. And it's worth also pointing out, going back to kind of variation 1, that usually you have the option. I was saying that you hold down that 3rd fret of the E. You can do it with either your pinky, your finger 4, or finger 3. It's actually up to you. Some people find using the ring finger on that 3rd fret easier in variation 1. Some people like to actually use the pinky because it doesn't feel like you're stretching your hand quite as much. Now, if you need to play the bar chord, we will be using variation 2 because we'll need our index finger to be playing the bar. And so this is sort of what we're looking for when it comes to variations. Now I just want to take some time to talk about the relative intervals within this chord, especially as an open chord. So you might notice, I mean, you would guess that we were walking on thin ice, just strumming way open, right? Like that, like that. You would assume that maybe some of these open strings, these middle 3 open strings, would have a contradiction, musical contradiction with a G major chord, right? But actually, you'll find as we go through each of the intervals that actually there is perfect harmony. It makes sense that we play all those notes open. So let's go ahead and just get through that. So we know that our root is G. There we go. So we have our root being G. Then what we're going to do is we're going to play our perfect 5th or major 3rd. These are the other components of our triad that we're looking for. So let's just go ahead and work out what that 2nd fret was holding down on the A. This note, the 2nd fret on A is A sharp, B, right? So how far is it from a G to a B? That's what we're trying to find out. So let's just start from G and count up the chromatic scale from here until we get to B, and then we can work out how many intervals that was, or what the name of that interval space is. So we have G, we have G sharp, we have A sharp, B, right? So G to B. And the amount of space, it's just like with the ruler example I gave in the past about intervals. We're going to say, you know, and you can use the fret dots sort of on your neck on the neck of your guitar to try to work out the space. So this I'm holding down fret 7, and I was holding down fret 3. So 7 minus 3 equals 4. So that space here is a space of 4 frets or semitones, which in an intervallic way is the major 3rd. So what we just discovered is that actually in this shape, with the G major shape, that when we hold down that 2nd fret of the A string to play the note B, we're actually not playing the perfect 5th as we saw with the A major or A minor chord. We're actually playing the major 3rd interval, right? And this can already start to inform us about why the minor is sort of difficult, because we would have to flatten that to play the G minor. and it's a little bit of an awkward shape. It's a little bit of a spread, so it's difficult to play. And as we go through the rest of these intervals, you'll find that there's actually a musical contradiction. So let's go ahead and move forward. We know now what the next note was. So G is our root. We have the B, which is our major third. What about this note here, which is the open D? So from G to D, this is actually our perfect fifth, perfect 5 interval. And we can work that out using the longhand way I've just shown. So let's keep moving forward. The next note that we see below that, so we have Eddie A Dynamite Good, another G. So this, the open string, the open G string, is the same note actually as the 3rd fret on the low E string, right? They're both G. So we just have an octave, so neutral impact there. Now let's keep moving forward. The open B string. That sounds nice, right? So the open B string on top of a G sounds familiar though, doesn't it? It sounds like that, right? Because we actually played a B already in the intervals we worked out just a moment ago. The 2nd fret on the A string is B, so the open B string is actually a major third. This is why there's a contradiction when you play the G minor as an open chord. Because when you play G minor as an open chord, you play the minor third, but then you're also playing the major third at the same time. And then finally, like I was saying, going back to that practical string rule, that reciprocal rule, whatever we do to the low string, if we do the same thing to the high string, a little bit flat here, whatever we do to that low string and the high string, if they're the same note. So yet another octave. We end up with 3 Gs. The 3 Gs inside of the G major chord. We have the 3rd fret on the E string, we have the open G string, and then we finally have the 3rd fret on the high E string. They're all Gs. So that is our intervallic sort of structuring. We have root, major third, followed by perfect fifth, followed by an octave, followed by another major third, and finally we have our next octave, the next octave up. So the advantages to this shape, why would you want to play this shape? So there is one chord progression I can think of that is pretty handy. Something like that. And in cadence structuring and stuff like that, the way we would think about that is kind of 1 going into its major 7th, going into its 6. So the 1, 7, 6, 1, 7, 6. So if you had to play that progression specifically, if you are a country musician or something, the G shape can be pretty handy. Another reason was an advantages to that open G shape is that it's quite bright and quite open, and so it's a little bit different. It's worth pointing out that the structuring of the intervals, the fact we have an octave on top, the fact that we have a major third close to the top, means that this is a very bright and major sounding open chord, and so you might want to use it for that purpose, because its physical shape lends itself to a certain sound you might prefer. But besides that, usually the G shape, I'll play it if I need to, but it's not the shape that I prefer. A, like I said before, is my favorite shape of all the bunch because there's so many variations that are possible. So now let's talk about troubleshooting this unique chord shape. When we look at the G major shape, it's actually pretty easy. It's pretty open, but one of the issues you might run into has to do with your index finger. So if your index finger, or finger 1, is getting, and this is in chord fretting variation number 1, where you would use your index finger for this. If you are fretting and your thumb is a bit high, because it sometimes can be when you're playing the G major, then what might happen is you might actually not have enough reach here, and you might find that your index finger, right, is actually leaning a little bit on the string just below that D string. And you might even hear that mute. And so to rectify this, what you'll do is you'll take your thumb and you'll move it down closer to the bottom, and you'll notice that you get tons more reach, and then you will want to follow correct fretting protocol. You will try to get your fingers perpendicular to the fretboard so as to leave that D string open, so you can get that clear sound out. This is actually very important in this case because if you don't get the D sound out, that's the only perfect fifth we have in this chord shape. So if you don't play it, you're going to lose that perfect fifth, and then that's going to sound a little less resonant. That's the main issue that I found. And then finally, some people do run into issues actually getting a clear sound of that high G. Again, you'll just want to make sure that you're not touching the metal fret bar and that you're not too far. So go back and watch that video about correct fretting if you're running into issues. Let me know how you get on with the G major chord. Do you like it? Is it the kind of chord that you like to use a lot? And what are some tips, some things that, for instance, you try that help make it easier? Thank you so much for watching. That just about does it for this video. If you did find it informative and helpful, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing. Thank you so much to everyone that does subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one. Ciao for now.